The United Nations predicts that as soon as the year 2022, India will surpass China as the world's most populous nation. By some accounts, India has already overtaken China in economic growth. To explore what that means for India's economic future, its relationship with Canada, and its place in the world economy, we're joined by Partha Mohanram. He is director of the India Innovation Institute at the Rotman School of Management at U of T. And Partha, it's good to have you back here. It's been a few years.
It's been 4 years and it's wonderful to be back.
But who's counting?
Not me.
Not you. Okay, good. Let's just put some facts up on India before we start our conversation, which will help bring people up to speed on where things are at. India's population, 1.25 billion people, with a GDP almost the same size as Canada's, $2.183 trillion. A growth rate, however, much north of Canada's at 7.3%. These are all estimates from the CIA World Factbook, so I want to start there. How accurate do you think those numbers really are?
I think those numbers are reasonably accurate. So these are not like numbers coming from like a government statistician and stuff. So I think those numbers do have some credibility. The one thing which must be mentioned is when you're talking about countries like India, it's probably more useful to look at PPP GDP numbers, purchasing power parity adjusted. So if you look at PPP numbers, for example, India is by all accounts the third biggest economy in the world. So traditional GDP numbers understate the size of the economies of countries like India and China and others, right? If you look at per capita numbers, the PPP per capita numbers for India are something like $6,500 a year per capita, as opposed to under 2,000 in like nominal GDP terms. So I think the numbers are reasonably accurate, though.
You know, we get very excited in this country if our growth rate hits 2.5% or even 2%. And India is now looking at growth rates north of 7%. And of course, one of the big questions is, can that persist? What do you think?
So certainly, firstly, it's well known that if your base is lower, and certainly India's base is pretty low, you have much more opportunities for growth. So those numbers are kind of natural. So it's natural to expect a country like India and China and some of the other developing countries to go at much faster rates because there's so much more to grow. Now, as far as whether that's sustainable, I think it has to be sustainable because a country like India, which is a young country getting younger, which is adding more and more people to the workforce on a annual basis, needs the growth. It needs the growth so that it can create employment opportunities for all these young people who are entering the workforce on an annual basis.
Well, you say it needs it. That doesn't mean it's going to get it.
I agree. So, but I think a combination of good economic policies and to some extent good fortune can certainly help India. So I'll give you an example of a couple of those. So for example, India is one of the few countries, in Canada we felt the pain of low oil prices, right? So with the Canadian dollar declining from above parity to as low as 69 cents and all the issues going on in the Alberta and the western part of the country. India is a huge importer of oil. And India has seen its oil bill fall drastically. It's actually allowed the government, for example, to cut subsidies on petroleum products without necessarily passing on the pain to the customer. So in some sense, it's allowed them to make a good and politically difficult decision, which is going to help them in the future, right? So that's an example of sort of macroeconomic luck from India's perspective. But there have also been some good policies taken not just by the current government, by a succession of governments. So for instance, India very recently passed a bankruptcy bill. So one of the big issues in India is the large percentage of non-performing loans and the unwillingness of, let's say, people to lend money simply because of fear that they're not going to get their money back. And one of the reasons why this is because India has not had a proper bankruptcy law in place. So the passage of the new bankruptcy law should encourage lending, which should encourage investment and therefore help the growth be maintained at these levels.
Let's talk poverty, though. India's poverty rate has declined a lot over the last 25 years. But even if it is, you tell me, is it 15, 20% of the population, something like that?
Those are numbers I have seen.
Okay, so even if it's 15 to 20% of the population, we are talking still
Absolutely.
200 million people, as a conservative estimate, still living in real dire poverty. I mean, that's very sobering, isn't it?
It is. But I would encourage all the viewers of TVO, when you look at a country like India or, for instance, China, right, to have a long-term what I call a time series approach and not a cross-sectional approach. Without getting technical, what it means is don't compare these countries to what USA and Canada look like today. Think about the sort of larger lens of history. Think about what, let's say, these countries would have looked like in the late 19th century with all the immigrants coming in and the tenements and so on and so forth, right? From that, you had tremendous growth, which led to prosperity and opportunity, which led to the countries being what they are right now. So I think the same is probably true for India. So the same numbers, it would have been 40%, maybe less than 2 decades ago. It's like a halving of the poverty rate, right? So there's tremendous work to be done. 20% of 1.25 billion is a big number. Like you pointed out, it's like the size, almost the size of the United States, 8 times the size of Canada. But that number is declining. And increasingly people are seeing fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, and that's encouraging investments. So you have this sort of transformational leapfrogging going on in India, where the application of technology by both the public and private sectors is helping the people at the bottom of the pyramid in many ways.
But if it took 2 decades to cut the poverty rate in half, and that is a tremendous accomplishment, let's not put our noses up at that. Do you think it'll take another 20 years to have the poverty rate again?
It'll probably take more, because I don't think poverty is going to be eliminated, and it gets more and more difficult to get to the sort of underlying roots of poverty, because there are some issues in India. Some of them are social, some of them are historical, and so on and so forth. But you cannot deny the tremendous accomplishments which have taken place and are continuing to take place. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So for example, the previous government started this very ambitious project called the Aadhaar project, or the UID project. It's trying to get every Indian a biometric ID. And if you just think about, you've seen India, you've seen the poverty, every single person should get an ID. And they started the project like 6 or 7 years ago under the previous Congress government. And the current BJP government was under tremendous pressure to cancel this project simply because it was the project of the previous government. So to their credit, they decided not to do that and continue with the implementation of the project. So this project is not without flaws. The fact is, as of like April of this year, 1 billion Indians have a unique ID. What this means is governments can work on things like transfers, trying to get people bank accounts, things that, in a sense, e-governance, things that can reduce corruption, reduce leakages.
They can plan.
They can plan. They know exactly what the people are, what their needs are, and so on and so forth. So to answer your original question about can poverty be eliminated, the answer is it's going to be incredibly difficult. But when you have high growth, and certainly the benefits are going to accrue disproportionately to the wealthy, but there's enough in that growth for everyone to benefit.
Let me ask a question that sort of looks at this from maybe, as they say, 35,000 feet up in the air. Turn of the century, there was a lot of talk about how the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, were going to take the world by storm. Their growth rates were up, and they were going to be showing us all how to do it. Well, not quite, right? I mean, Brazil is in a political mess right now. Their economy is tanking as well. Russia, we could go on for an hour about how bad Russia's doing right now. China, not much more political freedom, and growth rates have significantly gone down. And there's India really doing the best of all the BRIC countries. How come?
See, I'm going to go back to one of my earlier appearances on this show 4 years ago, where I used 2 terms, right? 2 words, the 2 demos, democracy and demographics. Both of them will always be in India's favor, because, you can talk about should we democratize first or should we grow first, and China has taken the let's grow first model, but that has its limitations. You've seen the problems going on with what's happening in Hong Kong, and it's spilling over to parts of China and stuff. But the biggest advantage for India is demographics. I think if I have my facts correct, the average Indian is 24, the average Chinese person is almost 40, and the average Indian is getting younger. The average Chinese person is getting older. And the sort of flip side of the one-child policy is China has a very skewed dependency ratio, and like an inverted pyramid, which is going to cause like problems, with growing healthcare costs and reducing labor force participation as time goes by.
And many more men than women.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So that's a problem India has as well, and there's a whole new show on that, but whole different show on that. But having said that, India has a young population, a growing population, And that has its challenges as well, because you need to create employment for all these people entering the workforce. So in some sense, that's why India has to grow.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. India, I gather the estimates are by the year 2022 is going to be the most populous country in the whole world,
Right.
going ahead of China. What's the upside? I can see the downside, having to create jobs for all of those new people. What's the upside?
See, for me, whether India is 1.28 and China is 1.26 is irrelevant. Can India sustain itself at its current population levels? One thing across history which has taken place is that, in general, Malthusian predictions about populations have not worked out, simply because people have not taken into account the fact that there are improvements in technology and productivity and so on and so forth. India, even though its population is growing, its growth rate is declining quite sharply. And people have looked at the growth rate is declining with increases of literacy, with improvements in female empowerment and so on and so forth. And it's happening throughout the country, including the sort of most backward parts of the country. So I think even though India's population is increasing, it's not increasing at an alarming rate, it's increasing at a declining rate. And clearly there are problems, pressures on land. India, if you've looked at a map, India is the 7th largest country in the world, but it's significantly smaller than, it's 1/3 the size of, let's say, China, Canada, or the US in terms of geography, right? The good news is almost all of India is arable, unlike some of the other countries. But the fact is you still have to feed and employ 1.2, 1.3 billion people, so that'll always be a challenge. But I firmly believe that, this is a challenge India and Indians can face. The one last thing I will say is, the West has traditionally looked at India versus China. I think the most interesting thing going on right now is India and China. So one of the largest investors in India is China. So if you look at all the very large Chinese e-commerce players, they're all in India right now, because the Chinese market has it's getting close to saturated, and they're seeing the big opportunities in India, because some of the same technological issues, like, for example, people said e-commerce would never take off in India and China because you can't have like banking and credit cards and stuff. And the Chinese people, Alibaba and all, have shown that you don't need that. They've come up with Alipay. So Alibaba is a big investor in some of the similar companies in India. So for example, you have companies like Paytm and Freecharge in India, which have completely revolutionizing e-commerce in India. So I think that's the big frontier. All these factors, right, are going to help. It's going to help government. It's going to help people at all levels of society, because essentially it's going to unleash efficiencies and productivity, which is going to only help the country.
Let's, in our last couple of minutes here, talk about your mandate at the India Innovation Institute at Rotman. What do you do?
So this is an institute which is, it's actually just located at Rotman. I must mention this is a U of T initiative. So what we are trying to do is we're trying to get the best minds and resources at U of T and indeed elsewhere to essentially try to highlight issues related to innovation and India. And it doesn't necessarily have to be one way. But it could be what ideas can a developed nation like Canada help? What can they provide to help a country like India, which clearly needs ideas to sustain its growth and so on and so forth? But it could easily be the other way around as well. There's lots going on in countries like India where people are doing innovation with very limited resources. And one of the things, living in a city like Toronto and stuff, we know that governments are very often resource constrained. So how can you be more efficient in the use of resources, right? So what we want to do in this institute is essentially get talks, discussions, get research on the word innovation in India defined very broadly. So what can developing countries learn, like India, learn from the West to innovate more successfully? And what can the West learn from countries like India or South Asia broadly on how to innovate frugally? So for example, we're trying to get prominent people to come and give talks. We're hoping to have the current RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan to potentially come and talk to us about, he's been one of the people who has been shepherding the Indian economy, which by the way has seen reduction in inflation rates and reasonably good macroeconomic performance while the world's economy has sort of been going through a lot of uncertainty. But I also am interested in trying to, for instance, get a student-run conference where the students would try to invite speakers and try to get panelists to get different topics discussed on, what's going on, what's innovative, what's going on in countries like India, what can Canada learn from it, and certainly, what can India learn from the experiences of the West as it tries to grow itself for the future.
Let me ask you one last question, and it's a bit of an offbeat question, but I asked the New York Times reporter Anand Girdhar asked this question once, and it was, where are you from originally?
I'm from the, you mean where in India?
Yeah.
I find that question extremely hard to answer. Let me explain to you why. So I'm ethnically South Indian, but I grew up most of my life in the North. So I grew up in Delhi and Bombay, but I'm Tamilian, so I'm from Chennai, but and my parents now live in Bangalore, and so I have allegiances to 5 or 6 different Indian cities. So.
Okay. Well, the question still works, which is there a part of you that feels the heartstrings tugging to go back and to apply your talents there to improve the country there?
That's an excellent question. And I think certainly that's a factor which comes up, not just from a talent perspective. As your parents get older, you feel as though, should I be here or should I be back in India where your parents live, and so on and so forth. But I think one of the things that the Indian diaspora has been very successful, in Canada, in the US and elsewhere, is they've been tremendous resources for the country. Right. So in terms of, if you look at Silicon Valley and innovation, there's a very strong Indian component in it. But some of it's also gone back to India in terms of investments, in terms of the location of many of their operations in India. So it's had tremendous benefits for India. So in my case as an academic, while I am based here in Canada and I was in the US before, I do spend a fair amount of time in India. So I was in India just recently. At the Indian School of Business, and similarly when I'm in India I try to take part in conferences and seminars and stuff. So I do kind of try to maintain this bicontinental existence.
And why, just finally, do you think Ontarians ought to care about what's going on in India?
So I think Ontarians specifically and Canadians in general should care about India for a number of reasons. So I have this view that if you think about, let's just take about Canada, the US, right? India and China, you ask the average Ontarian or the average Canadian what's going on in Asia. For them, Asia is China, right? And you ask the average Indian what's going on in the West, it's the US, right? I want to kind of shift the attention of the average Indian a bit to the north. And I want to sort of change the attention of the average Ontarian or Canadian a bit to the south. Because there's a lot going on between India and Canada and Ontario in specific. So we have a shared history. We have a very similar system. I mean, we are both like former British colonies. We have a very similar system of government, sort of the Westminster parliamentary democracy. English is the language of business in India. So India follows a common law, Anglo-Saxon common law system. Flawed as it might be, but the system of courts and stuff are still very similar. The Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, had a very successful visit to India just a few months ago, where she met the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, a couple of times. She met the leading industrialists, like the head of the Tata Group in India, and so on and so forth. It's pretty amazing because she was, for a subnational leader, to get that level of access. So clearly there's a lot of interest in India as well.
We should say, in the interest of equal time, Patrick Brown, the Conservative Party leader, considers Mr. Modi one of his best friends, and they've met a dozen times.
So the thing is, the relationship with India has nothing to do with political affiliation. I think it's very important for Canadians to just see it as an opportunity, right? So, and Canada can contribute a lot, and Ontario as well. So for example, we have tremendous education institutions in India, and the big growth is happening in education in India. India is also seeing a revolution in things like energy, especially renewable energy, and certainly that's an area where Canada and Ontario can provide lots of expertise. And so I think, and the last thing is, if you've just seen the changing demographics of Ontario, there's a very large diasporic presence here of South Asian diaspora. So I think they can serve as the link between these two countries. And I think that's why the prospects of sort of partnership between India and Ontario are very bright in my opinion.
Terrific. Good to see you again.
Nice to be back.
Thank you for this. Partha Mohanram, Professor of Financial Accounting and the Director of the India Innovation Institute at the Rotman School of Management, U of T.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.